morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to you all on this session on suicide awareness in the workplace. And this is suicide awareness, particularly in the context of higher risk situations such as redundancy and dismissal processes. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at how we can best support our colleagues with some empathy whilst fulfilling our duty of care and complying with the sort of quite numerous legal processes that we're obliged to comply with. As the title of this session suggests, we will be talking very openly about suicide. So please, if you think you may be affected by this, please do reach out to a work colleague, to a mental health first aider, or to a trusted friend for some support. So let me start by introducing my BAM colleagues on the panel here. And I'd like to ask James to introduce himself first, please.
Thank you, Ruth. Hi there, my name is James Walsh. I am a Senior Safe and Well Trainer for the Central Region for BAM UK and Ireland.
Lovely, thank you, James. Rhiannon Wynne, if I could ask you to introduce yourself, please.
Of course. Hello, I'm Rhiannon Wynne-Condren. My background is in site health and safety, and I've made the move from that role across into the wellbeing space, and I now work directly with Ruth.
That's lovely. Thank you, Rhiannon Wynne. And finally, Steve, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, thanks, Ruth. My name is Stephen Gray. I'm Head of Engineering Development within BAM UK and Ireland.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And I'm Ruth Pott. I'm actually Head of Workplace Wellbeing at BAM, and I originally joined BAM as HR Director back in 2011. So my background is very much HR. Hence, looking at a bit of a focus here on sort of HR processes. But I've been working in the wellbeing space for about the last 7 or 8 years now, and working very closely with Rhiannon Wynne, but also with Steve and with James. So let's start with Rhiannon Wynne. Rhiannon Wynne, I know that you support a large number of colleagues across our business. Could you share with us some of the changes that you've noticed in the last year or so with the people that you've been supporting within BAM, please?
Of course. So we've seen a big increase in the number of people coming forward, telling us that they're struggling and asking what help and support is available for them. So this includes people who are undergoing business processes, be that people who are at risk of redundancy, individuals who are going through disciplinary or grievance processes or compliance investigations. I think it's fair to say that in some instances, people who are undergoing such business processes don't necessarily feel that they're being supported as they would wish to be, and that there can be a lack of empathy, with the focus being very much on the business process and maybe not as focused on the individual as we would like it to be.
That's a great start and introduction to that, Rhiannon Wynne. Thank you. James, I know that you've had a really sad family situation with your brother Paul, which was nearly 3 years ago, back in 2023. Would you mind sharing with us what happened to Paul, please?
Of course, yeah. Paul was my youngest brother. He was 40. He passed away in July 2023 following quite a long battle with drug addiction and poor mental health. One of the trigger points to that was the fact that he lost his job as a bricklayer previously when he failed a drug and alcohol test. After that, we lost our mum suddenly. She had a heart attack, and Paul found her body. And it hit him quite hard. He never really recovered from it. He was also in a very toxic relationship, which was fueled by addiction, unfortunately. That came to an end after the kids were taken into care. In July, they broke up for good. Paul ended up in a hostel in Birmingham. And at that point, he'd been clean from drugs for about 6 weeks. But once his relationship came to an end, he took a decision to inject a huge amount of heroin, which ended his life. And it was classed as a fatal dose. He left behind 4 daughters. His father, who I look after because he's disabled, 3 siblings. And as a family, we've all really struggled at times losing Paul in such sad circumstances. And for me, I'll always remember him as being that 12-year-old little scamp of a brother, real petrol head that I used to take to car shows and so on. He'd often be found with his legs poking out from underneath a car, passing me spanners and fixing some old wreck of a car that I've got. And actually, on April 23rd this year, I've got a Wellbeing Day where I'm doing a driving experience, and I've chosen one of the cars, which is a Subaru Impreza Turbo, which is Paul's favourite car. And I'll be driving that with a bit of a smile on my face, hoping that his spirit's in the car with me.
That is such a personal story, James. I know you've shared it with us before, but it's still incredibly sad listening to it. So thank you for that. Steve, I know that you've had a really difficult situation whilst actually working on a BAM project. Could you tell us what happened with you, please?
Yeah, certainly, Ruth. I suppose, like a lot of other people in this business, I've always liked to sort my own problems out, and was never one for asking for help or anything. So I start by saying that prior to my current job as head of engineering development, I've spent almost all my career being project based, from every role from site engineer, assistant engineer, up to project director. And this particular challenge I had was when I was in a project director situation. It's also important to understand the sort of history and how upbringing plays a major part in how we develop as people. So, I grew up in a time and an era when the following phrases were part of everyday life. Things like boys don't cry, man up, grow up, get on with it. Just stop moaning, get on with what you're doing. Emotions weren't talked about in public, and we were actively pushed as we were bringing up into not showing emotion, as that was always deemed as a sign of weakness. So with that in mind, around about 2016, I was asked to move on to an ongoing project that we had in the business, which for a number of reasons had started to experience a few problems, and those problems just kept on growing. So throughout 2016, 2017, the project was challenging, but probably didn't appear any different to any other challenging projects I'd worked on over the years. But by the time we got into 2018, things were changing, and with the benefit of hindsight, the changes were with me more than with the project. The project still had as many issues, but I was starting to struggle a lot more internally. I was doubting my ability to deal with the issues of the project. The doubt that started in the back of my head was very quickly developing into a sort of all-encompassing sense of failure. Couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. I couldn't work out how to solve the issues that we're going through. Throughout this period, I couldn't tell anybody about my thoughts. Couldn't tell family, colleagues, friends. I was maybe in my head perceived as head of the family, as the leader of the project. Therefore, I couldn't share the concerns that I had. Towards the end of 2018, I knew I needed to do something. I contacted HR to explain I was concerned about the team, because I still couldn't admit out loud that I had more of an issue with myself than I actually did with the rest of the team, even though I could see that it was about other people as well as just me. I could see people start to struggle. I could see the team looking tired, they were looking fatigued. Some were becoming more withdrawn, others weren't able to switch off. They were working longer hours, they were working longer weekends. So after that, the book arranged for a counsellor to come to site, and she held a series of one-to-one sessions with about 10 of us. And as a result of that, I'd had a few conversations with Ruth at this stage and some of the sort of senior managers about what we could do and how people could be supported. The council identified a few of us that needed further support, and I was given a contact number to carry out a telephone assessment, which was very quick. I think I probably did it on the day after the council came. I can't remember, if I'm honest, all the events. It's funny, but my sort of life is a little bit blurred in around that period for about 8 or 9 months. The things I remember really well, things I don't remember very well. But I did the telephone assessment, and I was advised that I was suffering from severe depression and moderate to severe anxiety, which I was then referred back to Bupa, and managed very quickly to gain access to a counsellor. So I started booking counselling sessions very shortly after that, with somebody local to me at home. At this point in time, I still couldn't talk to anybody else about it, so I hadn't spoken to anybody else at work, hadn't spoken to my manager, colleagues, hadn't spoken to my wife or my son. This was a private thing I was just still really trying to deal with and didn't know how I was going to get through the situation. First day with the counsellor, the first session with the counsellor, she sat, she listened. I was a bit of an emotional wreck, which was a real shock to my system. That, it's just amazing how the feelings start coming out when your emotions start coming out when you start talking about these sorts of things. Counsellors state that I shouldn't be at work, but again, I suppose this is maybe an ego thing. I wasn't ready to admit that in my head, was perceived that I was failing what I wanted to do. So I didn't stop work. I sort of carried on through it. But what I did do fairly quickly after that was I then contacted my line manager and arranged for a session with him. But the thought was going through my head when the counsellor had said about stopping work was it real fear. This was like opening Pandora's box. If I open it up, we'll never get lid back on. Struggling with emotions, and if I spoke out loud about feelings, can I control them? I couldn't control my emotions in front of a counsellor, but I sort of accepted that. But there's no way I could be that person in front of a line manager or somebody at work. I had a real underlying issue about failure. I was failing people at work. I was failing my family. I should be the strong person in the team and at home who would be there to support everybody else. Same thing with pride. I'm somebody that I believed others should be looking up to. Was scared about how other people would see me. And my previous experiences in management had always taught me, find a way out. You're there, you've paid well to manage the lead project, to find yourself out, find a way out of everything. But after my first session, when I admitted the line manager and my wife, I then got great support from them in private life and work life, and I started a fairly intense 6-month spell of counselling. I stayed on the project through a lot of that. I stayed on the project for about 4 months of counselling. Again, I think it was probably my ego that meant I couldn't walk away from the job. I needed to do it in my own terms, and I knew the holiday coming up, so I'd explained in a lot of detail with my line manager about if I can get myself to the holiday period, then I can take a bit of time and have a natural break out of things then. So that's what I did. So I got a lot of support inside and outside of work, got through 4 months, took my holiday, and then moved away from the project. And took a little bit of time off after that as well. My counselling continued until probably just before COVID. I think I had just under a year of counselling there. And I'd started to get away from counselling when COVID came up, and I'd actually started switching on to medication as a form of support rather than the counselling side of things. I do still wonder now as to what would have been my next move if I hadn't sought support. What would have gone next? I genuinely don't know the answer to that. Another strange thing I've had in my head is that I've feel for a long time that I never made it back to 100% of what I could do before. But with a bit of time, what I've realised is that what I am doing now is actually 100%. What I was doing before wasn't sustainable, and that's something that I use to talk to a lot of colleagues who've spoken to me after I've come out and had conversations like this with them. That we're working unhealthily. That's why we get into difficulties. And when you come back and you don't think you're working 100%, you really are. So this is a few years ago for me now. The recovery time and the time since then has given me an opportunity to reflect. I feel a far better person for understanding and accepting what are still there is sort of perceived weaknesses that I have. But I understand myself an awful lot better as a result of this. So yeah, it's a bit of a positive after a period of turmoil.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Steve. I think, reflecting back on 2018, we were all in a really different place in terms of mental health and well-being. So for you to have come forward in the way that you did, asking for the help that you obviously needed as a senior project director on that particular project. I remember those conversations well. But, that was a real game changer for us at BAM in taking this forward and trying to be a bit more proactive. Rhiannon, just thinking about 2025, you sort of touched on, the volume of conversations that you've had with colleagues. What was different last year, 2025, to say 24 or 23 in respect to people coming forward and seeking help?
I think this is due to the amount of work that we've been doing in the wellbeing space in telling people that it's okay not to be okay and that help and support is available for them. I have to say, I'm proud of the fact that these individuals have confidence both in the people that they open up to and also in the wider business. I feel very strongly that the fact that these people feel able to come forward and share that they're struggling is a massive positive. And I'm also aware of situations where individuals who have come forward and who have had professional support then open up about the support they receive to someone else who's struggling, which then encourages these other people to come forward and ask for support for themselves.
Yeah, I think the snowball effect of doing this is massive. And I take it as a great measure of success that people come forward, because previously we've always had the issue, but actually the difference is people are telling us now. And when I reflect on my time in HR and obviously more recently in wellbeing, I think people involuntarily leaving the business, were being put through due process, certainly with the focus on ensuring legal compliance, to avoid employment tribunals, and rarely considering the sort of the emotional fallout and the deep distress that such processes can cause. It doesn't cause deep distress for everybody, but it clearly does with some. And again, just reflecting on my experience, I think there's always been a belief, particularly in sort of business reorganisation, redundancy situations where somebody is perhaps being paid more than the statutory minimum, or maybe somebody more senior, that paying additional money makes it okay for them. And I actually now know, however senior somebody is, and I do occasionally meet up with colleagues who left the business a long time ago, including in my previous employer. Even people who are really senior and actually get quite a lot of, get a big payout. For some of them, it absolutely floors them, and it has taken them to that sort of metaphoric, very dark place. So we need to look after everybody here. And of course, there are some who would only get statutory payments, or in the cases of sort of gross misconduct, they may not get any money at all. So clearly, it could be financially devastating, as well as the sort of embarrassment and shame that goes with this, and actually having to go home and explain to your partner why you no longer have a job. James, although the employers of your brother were obviously legally compliant and perfectly entitled to dismiss Paul in the circumstances they had, if you're able to advise them now, how would you suggest that they'd be able to improve the support they give to a vulnerable employee in such circumstances?
I think, firstly, Ruth, we absolutely need a strong set of rules for drugs and alcohol use, particularly on site, and site safety can't be compromised.
And of course, rail safety, as we're in a rail wellbeing event.
Yeah, of course. However, for someone struggling with any form of addiction, the difference between life and death could be the right sort of support leading to potential rehabilitation. And think about this for a second. If you are somebody that loses their job because of a failed drug and alcohol test and you work in the rail sector, potentially you might end up not being able to work in that sector for a period of time, and you completely lose your livelihood, your income stream, your pride, your skill, everything you've worked for. And all of a sudden that's no longer there. And you then have to find a new job, start again, retrain, reskill, reduce your income, etc. And that can be devastating. And I think as a rail sector in particular, we have an aging workforce. Of course we do. We are doing our very best to recruit younger people. But if we're continuing to lose people through things like failure of drug and alcohol tests and addiction, we can do more to actually rehabilitate people and keep them in the sector, hopefully stay working in the sector and to get well again. There are many, many support organisations and charities which could work with our contractors and tier one partners and clients to help people understand addiction and to help them access the right support. I'd also say that, for anybody that's a HR professional or management professional that's going through this process with somebody for the 100th time, it's important to remember that for the person at the other end, it may be their first time. They will be scared, they'll be confused, they'll be anxious. Every piece of communication and engagement to them matters, and the potential impact on them could be life-changing, but it should never be life-threatening. So I really think about.
Yeah, so I was going to say I completely agree with, being life-changing, but it shouldn't be life-threatening. I think the communication point is really important. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So in respect of identifying the emotional impact of losing your job and having identified this as an issue within our organisation, we have undertaken to try and address this. And although many of our HR business partners and compliance colleagues are mental health, they are trained mental health first aiders, we are in the process of putting in additional training in place for such colleagues to really help enhance the psychological safety and mental well-being and to mitigate against more serious impacts on those affected. And of course, when we were having conversations with our HR colleagues, the one thing we kind of completely overlooked was the emotional impact on them of dealing with such difficult processes and circumstances. So again, we're also making sure that we properly and fully support them, and dealing with such difficult work and colleagues who may be very distressed. So for the training that we're going to have in place in the next sort of 3 or 4 months, using an organisation we've used before, they're very familiar with our business and they're really working hard to help us ensure that we can better support colleagues going through such difficult work processes. Railwell, I know that we've often put in direct counselling. I know Steve was referring to some of this with the project he had several years ago, but can you just talk through us how we're using counselling now for those that we've identified who may be at risk?
Yeah, sure. So we currently arrange counselling for anyone who reaches out expressing that they're having thoughts of suicide. And once we will have carried out this training with our colleagues, then in situations where HR or compliance identifies someone who may be high risk, we will offer them counselling immediately, being proactive with getting a counsellor to phone the individual directly with the knowledge and consent of the individual, of course. Previously, we would just have reminded colleagues of the support available to them and would have just given them the details of the EAP and left it to them to sort out. But now we take the initiative where we feel it's appropriate to do so.
Yeah, and I do think all employers should think about actually doing this. I think greater awareness of the impact of such conversations and just putting a bit more humanity and empathy into the process and offering support and trying to be proactive, such as an employee assistance programme or talking directly to qualified people such as counsellors will go a long way to actually fulfilling that duty of care that we've previously talked about, but actually just as importantly, because actually it really is the right thing to do in these really difficult situations. There was a really interesting article a while ago, which may be familiar to some of our safety colleagues, in the IOSH magazine about this time 3 years ago, early 23. It was written by a senior coroner, Kevin McCaughlin, and he was suggesting that employers may be subject to scrutiny in the future for failing to protect the mental health of employees who then go on to complete suicide. And there have been 2 or 3 really high-profile cases since then. The most high-profile probably has been Ruth Kelly, the head teacher who died by suicide in 2023, following the grading of inadequate of her school by Ofsted. And her family said that she died as a direct result of the pressure put on her by the process and the outcome of an Ofsted inspection. And the coroner at the subsequent inquest pretty much agreed with that. They also found that her employer, because with this particular case there was the Ofsted, and Ruth Kelly was actually employed by Reading Borough Council. But there were sort of multiple failings there that all compounded to the very poor mental health of Ruth Kelly. And the second was a young lady, Jace Lee Louise Beck, who was a gunner in the British Army, and this is a really high-profile inquest verdict. I think it was this time last year, and she died after the Army failed to properly investigate sexual assault claims and harassment that she had made. So again, really, really negative publicity for big employers there. Coming back to your point, James, on the importance of communication during these processes, a third example and nothing to do with coroners or media reporting, but a really good friend of mine who was made redundant at the end of last year. When he knew that this was on the cards, he sort of tried to pick my HR and wellbeing brains, such as they are, to talk through an offer that he'd had as part of a protected conversation with his line manager and with HR. And he was given a 2-week deadline by HR within which to accept the offer or decline it, of course. He replied within the deadline, which was a particular Friday, but he was then really upset and really, really anxious. I mean, seriously anxious that having responded within the timeline that he was given, he then had an immediate out of office that said, "Thanks for your email. I'm out of the office till Wednesday and I'll deal with your query then." So for my friend, he actually took this as, "You're not important. The deadline wasn't important. We'll deal with it as and when. You're just a number, not a name." He took it really, really personally. So again, it was it was massively important to him as it was pulling the rug on his sort of short-term and medium-term financial security. And of course, he not unreasonably actually expected his case to be dealt with really, really quickly. So obviously we've talked about the risk of coroners. There's always the risk of personal injury claims as well. So, we do need to look at this a lot more seriously and compassionately. Steve, coming back to you, what do you think employers can do to better sort of support their teams during these really difficult work processes?
For me, Ruth, I think it's all about being more proactive in supporting staff, and it's great to hear Rhiannon's comment about everybody's going through some of these processes. Are not only being offered the service, but the service are actually being proactive in calling individuals. I think that's massively important, and I think that is the way forward. That's what we should be doing in all situations. But I do think that there are lots of other areas as well as within these process issues that they have around redundancies or areas like that, but just typically within the challenges of being on projects where more needs to be done to sort of mandate mental health screening. We mandate health screening, and we do that, and every who's project based will have health screening on a regular basis where they'll be checked for all sorts of different things. Why aren't we doing the same thing with a sort of counselling service? Because our senior managers know where the challenging projects are, and whether it's challenging because of the purely just the work environment, the pressure of the client, the job, or whether it's also challenging because you've got that aligned with business restructuring or other processes that are going to. I think our leaders know where a lot of the bigger issues are, and I think more can be done to proactively support staff in these places.
Yeah, no, I would agree completely. I think there's a huge role for leaders in terms of promoting the well-being of their teams and their colleagues, and just sharing their own vulnerabilities and experiences. James, if there was somebody watching this who's perhaps feeling very down at the moment, what would be the message that you would have for them?
I think the first thing, Ruth, for me is that having lived with the impact of losing a relative by suicide, it's been incredibly difficult for the entire family. I'm fortunate that I've been able to put a lot of that effort into learning more and helping reach people at risk of suicide and poor mental health. But my key message to them would be that it's okay to feel or to be not okay. You're likely to be feeling that way because you're either unwell or things and circumstances are out of your control. You will get better. You can get better. Things will and can improve. I know it's not like a leg break or a toothache, and your symptoms don't always get fixed with a prescription or just a simple procedure. Taking that first step, I know, is incredibly difficult to reach out and talk to somebody. But once you've made that first step, your journey has already begun. You're not alone on that journey. Support is there, and people are there and willing to help you take every step, no matter how big or small. So yeah, don't struggle. Reach out and talk to somebody.
I think that's a really important message, that actually, however bad you're feeling, there is so much support out there that can help you feel better. And I think that applies to everybody, senior leaders included. Nobody's immune from any of this. Rhiannon Wynne, any final thoughts or advice for employers who are actually watching this and who may be thinking, oh gosh, maybe we need to be doing a little bit more on managing some of these risks? What would your thoughts be for them?
Well, much of this conversation has been on legal compliance and reducing risk. Please remember that we're dealing with human beings who are possibly in a very vulnerable state with lots of uncertainties about their livelihood and future. I remember a conversation I had with an individual who was dismissed after a disciplinary investigation. He told me that while it had been hard, the HR business partner dealing with his case had treated him respectfully and with empathy, and how much that mattered to him. But the most important thing to remember that it is absolutely the right thing to do to minimise the risk of our colleagues dying by suicide. And I'd also like to add that if anybody watching this is struggling, you are not alone. There is always someone to listen to you. There is always hope, and you matter. Please reach out to somebody.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon Wynne. I think we would all 100% agree with that. There is so much help out there. Please do reach out for it. And fundamentally, that was where all the wellbeing work at BAM started. It was because it was the right thing to do. And I could have written on my notes here in big letters, because it is the right thing to do, because it is the right thing to do. So that concludes the sort of formal part of this panel conversation. I'd really like to massively thank James, Steve and Rhiannon Wynne for their really honest and open thoughts and sharing the most extraordinarily personal experiences. I'm hugely appreciative to you for doing that, and I hope everybody listening will also have learned something from your experience, and we'd be very happy to now take any questions that you may have. Thank you so much for all your questions. Some really great questions here that my lovely panel will answer. So I'm joined again by James, by Steve and by Rhiannon Wynne. We've got a number of questions here, all on slightly different themes, but I'll start with the one that has the most likes on it, and that's: how can we encourage line managers to create or maintain a psychologically safe environment so that employees feel that they can raise mental health issues with them before they actually get too bad? And I just wonder, Rhiannon Wynne, perhaps you could share some of your thoughts on this, because I know this is something you do spend an awful lot of time doing, is supporting line managers and employees.
Yeah, sure. To me, that fundamentally comes down to two issues, and that's culture. That's your culture within your organisation, and it's also your relationships, isn't it? Line manager, relationships with people. And at BAM, as we panellists know, we have a really good culture, and that's something that doesn't come overnight. That's something that you have to work at. But it's also about being open. We all have good days and bad days, and it fundamentally comes back to that it is okay not to be okay. And it's being open. And I'll bring this back to you, actually, Ruth, because I know that within BAM, you are always really keen to have our senior leaders or leaders across the organisation to talk about their personal experiences when they're struggling. So I'll bring that back to you, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. I think that's a really, really good point. And over the years, we've had some of our most senior people, and actually very, very recently, we've had some very senior colleagues in the business share their own personal stories. And that really sets the scene for it, making it okay for line managers to have such conversations and employees to feel okay coming forward to just say they're not feeling great and where can they get help. Thank you for that, Rhiannon Wynne. The second question is there some kind of scale that's used to identify suicide risks when redundancies are being planned? The honest answer to that is no, there isn't. In respect of coming from a non-clinical perspective, coming in from a layperson, so an HR or a compliance aspect, scales are used. When somebody goes to their GP or they go to a counsellor or a therapist, there are scales that are used to assess how anxious or how depressed somebody is. But I'm not aware of people using that in redundancy situations. So unless you've got occupational health nurses being involved in the process, the way you would assess risk, and it kind of comes on to some of the other questions that we'll have in just a moment. But it's making sure that people having the conversations are trained. There's mental health first aid training. There's additional training. That's the training that we're putting in place at BAM. So it is quite difficult, and there isn't any sort of scientific way of identifying those risks. How can HR balance legal responsibilities with showing genuine compassion in high-risk situations? Again, perhaps if our colleagues feel free to chip in on this one. HR balancing legal responsibilities, it's a really difficult one because obviously HR colleagues are always trying to avoid employment tribunals. From a wellbeing perspective, I'm trying to avoid coroner's courts. So we have to have a balance there. But I think it's just trying to make sure that there is a heavy legal compliance element there. But I think with training and awareness and an understanding of the impact these processes can have on people, particularly if they're long protracted processes, where the communication is perceived to not be that great, that's where some of the problems come about. So again, it's just thinking through, it's just putting yourself, if you're on the side of HR, it's putting yourself in that other person's shoes and really just trying to think, how are they going to receive this message? What else have they got going on in their life? How might this be affecting them? James, I think this is a question for you. If somebody's working near the platforms near OLE, who shows also shown signs of suicide, but where it's felt that working is actually keeping them mentally stable, how can we perhaps tackle this situation whilst actually keeping them safe? Because clearly we have a duty of care to keep them and others safe, but removing them from their job could also make their own personal situation worse and put them into an unstable place.
Yeah, I think this is a difficult situation for anyone who finds themselves here. The first things first is putting the support in place for that person and understanding where that person's at and what they might need. Safety is critical and well-being is vital at the same sort of time. Finding the balance of stability and keeping somebody working safely is the most important thing. What we don't want to do is remove the stability, because work might be the only stable thing that they have in their life at that time. So I think it's an open and honest conversation, taking it step by step to make sure that the person has the right support and people are aware and they understand of the situation that the person is in. So we can all look out for people, especially in dangerous environments. I think it's a genuine concern. It's a great question, but I just think it's one of those things we have to carefully balance out. And there may even be an opportunity to get the person to continue working, but on a different part of the project, perhaps, without them feeling like they're being punished. And that's the key thing. We don't want people to feel like they're being punished. We want people to feel like they're being supported.
Yeah, I'd say the word balance keeps coming into this, and it's a really, really difficult balance on protecting the interests of the employer and the company, the interests and the safety of the individual. So it is a balance, and it's very hard to be prescriptive here. You have to assess each case on its own merits and talk to the individuals concerned. So thank you for that, James. How can supervisors support someone in crisis while actually keeping the operation running safely? Again, maybe James, if I could just come back to you. I think you've sort of kind of touched on some of these points, but actually supporting somebody who we know is in crisis.
I think the key word there is crisis. If somebody is in crisis and their health and well-being is not right, they're far more likely to be unsafe at site. So I think we have to make sure that the person's support is in place. Otherwise, the safety is at risk. So we have to be in a position to have an open, honest conversation with them, and critically to get the support to them as soon as they possibly can. And I've seen this happen on site. And it's just sometimes the power of that 10-minute conversation with a wellbeing champion can make the world of difference within a really short time. The key focus here has to be somebody in crisis may not be the safest person on site. We need to get them out of crisis or supported to reduce the safety risk. And that's the key thing I would say there.
Yeah, and it's not always the person who's obviously in crisis either. The one who's in crisis is the person who we've actually identified as needing help or who's come forward for help. But of course, not
Absolutely.
everybody exhibits that, so we need to be aware of that as well. Thank you for that, James. Following a redundancy period, when people have left, how long after they've left should we be checking in on them? Again, I wouldn't want to be prescriptive on this. I mean, from a legal perspective, I'm not aware that there's any legal obligation to do that, but clearly this is something that we're identifying as actually we do kind of have a moral obligation to do this. And I think it depends on the circumstances. Certainly, we are providing support to a very small number of people, but people where we've identified there is a need to be providing them with actually clinical support. Certainly, if you're in a position where you can continue with employee assistance program support and just make that available for 3 months, 6 months after somebody has left the organisation. But I think if it's somebody who you've identified as being higher risk, then it may need to be clinical support and a little bit more. But again, I think that's down for individual organisations to decide what's appropriate for them. What impact do you think the results of the CLC mental health project will have on improving organisational factors that adversely affect people's mental health? I haven't seen the results of the survey that's been done yet, but I have been involved with the working group on that. I think, there's a lot going on in terms of improving mental health in the workplace, particularly in construction. There's also the ICO, a guide that's come out on suicide awareness and prevention in the workplace. And I think if more employers can proactively manage all of these issues and put measures in the workplace, put the training in, that has to be a great thing for everybody. Yes, I'm sure it will have a really positive impact. It's just how soon can we actually start seeing measures there, particularly in smaller companies, where I think the need is probably greater. Experiencing firsthand the tragic loss of a fantastic colleague to suicide, we were all surprised how he was clearly struggling. Mental health for some is such a private thing. We all feel terrible we didn't pick up on his struggles. Could there have been less obvious signs that we missed? Without knowing the details, it's really hard to comment. Some people, I think our experience, and I will ask colleagues, Rhiannon, James and Steve to add to this, some people are so intensely private. It's not always possible to pick up on the signs. It really isn't. Some people, I think when you see some of the videos that have come out, the Norwich City Football Club video, the one that springs to mind, where on the face of it, somebody was happy and cheerful, and then the next day they're not there. People can be really skilled at hiding it. Rhiannon, Steve, James, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, can I jump in there, actually, please,
Yeah, please
Ruth?
do.
The thing is, I'm really sorry that this has happened to your colleague. And I'm going to jump back now to 2018 when I did a 2-day suicide prevention training course. And what I learned then, and this has actually stuck with me, is that some people will have a plan. I mean, for some, suicide is a knee-jerk reaction to a situation. Some people have got a real clear, thought-out plan. They might not act on it for years, but if they do act on it, then unfortunately there's very little that can be done. And I appreciate that you feel terrible, but you know what? You can't take that on. And it's just, and this is why this is so important, that we talk and that we are really open so that people feel that they can come forwards when they're struggling. Back to you, Ruth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether James or Steve have got anything else to add to that.
I'll let Steve go first.
I'll quickly come in, Ruth. It's a terrible situation, obviously, but people can be very, very good at hiding things, and I know that from my own experience. Nobody I was working with or family knew what was going on in my head, because we're very, very private people, and we don't like to share, and you can't always tell a thing by people's moods either, because as Rhiannon's just said, when people can have a plan, and if they've got a plan, then it's very, very difficult to be able to stop that. But quite often when somebody has got a plan, the mood actually lifts, and you don't notice any the sort of normal telling times of somebody who's going through a really difficult period of being quiet, being isolated, because the mood lifts because of the reason that they've got a plan, and they're getting to a position where they're going to do something about it. So the light at the end of the tunnel is becoming clearer for them, and it's it's a horrible situation, but you can't feel guilty about, did I miss anything? Was there something I didn't see?
I would agree, and thank you for that. And I think the only sort of final comment on that desperately sad situation is for colleagues who've been left behind, who've been affected, make sure that they've got the right support in place, for now when the incident has happened, but also when there's an inquest that's taking place. Obviously, there'll be a funeral, then an inquest, and then anniversaries thereafter. And just to make sure that people are properly supported, because that is one of the most devastating experiences that anybody can go through, is losing somebody to suicide. So I see that we've just rapidly running out of time. There are a couple of questions that were left there. That I did see one on redundancy, which was kind of alluding to redundancy consultation. There isn't any easy way to circumvent putting people in a redundancy pool, unfortunately. But if you're in that situation, please do just think about the massive impact that this can have on people, and make sure that everybody is supported. And it just remains for me to thank our amazing panel here, James Walsh, Rhiannon Wynne-Condren, and Steve Gray, for sharing their very personal story, very, very personal stories. Hugely appreciative. And I hope that everybody watching has found something useful in this really quite difficult subject area. But thank you so much for your time and watching.